Hello, everyone, here and on Zoom. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Derek Pratt, and I'm Director of Education and Public Programming here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you as well to the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for supporting all of our lectures this year. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, and politically. One area it greatly impacted was the burgeoning salt industry in upstate New York, most notably here in the salt city of Syracuse, but throughout the state as well. And before we get to that, I just wanted to let you know about a few upcoming events here at the Erie Canal Museum. First, on December 7th at 1 p.m., we'll be hosting one of our 2024 Erie Canal artists in residence, Clara Riedlinger, who will discuss her project photographing remnants of the burned over district along the Erie Canal, including Adams, New York. She has photographed and the legacy of the Second Great Awakening, the religious revival movement that swept along the banks of the canal after its opening. We're also happy to announce that all three of our 2024 artists in residence will have their work displayed early next year at the Everson Museum of Art. So please keep an eye out for more information on that coming soon. We also have another temporary exhibit of art by SU professor Mary Page that is going up right now in the Link Gallery. Those of you who are here walked through it. So check it out. That'll be up through April. Anyway, our next lunchtime lecture will be on December 19th and will feature various members of our staff here at the Canal Museum, highlighting some of our favorite objects in the collection and telling the stories behind them. A reminder that all of our lectures are offered both virtually and in person, as well as recorded for everyone who registers. We have an annual pass that gets you access to all of our lectures. And if you register this month or next, you'll get access to all the talks for this year as well as next. And next year is, of course, the Canal's Bicentennial. So we plan on having some incredible speakers next year that you're not going to want to miss out on, like Hugh Ryan, author of When Brooklyn Was Queer, labor historian Peter Way, who wrote the seminal canal history, Common Labor, Duncan Hay, who I think might be on this call, will be discussing the Barge Canal, and many more. Additionally, a new feature we are adding to our lot tender membership level is a complimentary registration to the annual pass. So consider signing up for that membership level or higher if you're interested. Never miss an Erie Canal Museum lecture again. All right. And finally, tonight marks the opening of our 39th annual Gingerbread Gallery. This fun holiday tradition highlights almost 50 locally made gingerbread creations this year and is a great time for everyone. Like I said, the gallery opens tonight with our members' holiday soiree and is open to the public starting tomorrow morning, November 22nd, and runs through January 12th. Next Friday, November 29th, will be our grand opening from 4 to 6 p.m., which will feature live music from Merry Mischief, as well as cookies and cocoa. We hope you can make it at some point these next few months and see these wonderful gingerbread creations. Anyway, now on to today's event. We're happy to be joined by Donna Scott, a director of the Friends of Salt Point, as well as a member of the Lansing Historical Society, among many other things. She is retired from Cornell University. She has many interests, including the history of bicycle development, old houses, and salt production in New York State. She is also an officer in the Funeral Consumers Alliance of the Finger Lakes and a member of the Cayuga Bird Club. We're happy to be hosting her today. All right.
Well, thank you, Derek. And I'm glad to be here today. So this was quite a project I undertook to put together this talk and this information. And this research work that I did for 6 months or more was done to document the shipment of salt from the two big Finger Lakes, Cayuga and Seneca, but mainly from Cayuga Lake up to the Erie Canal. The town of Lansing, which is just north of Ithaca, is the site of not only a former refined brine salt works that made table salt, but also a huge rock salt mine 2,000 feet below ground, all under Cayuga Lake. Lansing, until recently, was mainly a rural and industrial town with only amateur historians. Often when they had information and relevant people before them, they didn't think to write down many aspects of their history. This was the case with the transport of salt to market. Such transport was probably just taken for granted. At the time, everybody knew how it was done, so why write it down? So I spent about 6 or 7 months trying to find records and information that could tell us about the shipment of salt products via the lakes to the Erie Canal. And for you canal experts here, this talk was developed for a general audience who may not be familiar with the history of either salt production in New York State or the Erie Canal and its lateral canals. So what we'll go through today is the origins of salt in our area of the world and the early salt companies in the 1800s, a little bit about the Erie Canal over the decades, a bit about boating history related to canals and the lakes, and then also some info about salt production and shipping. And this is both refined salt, in other words, table salt, food salt, and rock salt, like we use on the roads in wintertime. So the salt below us in this whole region of the Northeast US came from a shallow inland sea that covered this whole area over 400 million years ago. And over the eons, sea levels repeatedly rose and fell, leaving many layers of salt, some over 100 feet thick or more, and often quite pure. Although erosion of nearby mountains caused deposits of debris between the salt layers. And as far as the New York State salt industry, the earliest big industry was the Onondaga Lake Works from 1790. That actually was in operation until 1928. So right here in Syracuse, I drove by the area today on the way here. The salt here was found in ground level seeps or springs, and they refined it or evaporated it using either the sun for solar evaporation or boiling it over fires. In the 1870s and 80s, there were many deep brine wells in Western New York. There were quite a few all over the place. And this is pretty well documented in a 1917 book I found about the salt industry in New York. There were also a few mines there, and the Retzoff mine is the most famous one out in Western New York. And that's about all we're going to say about those. But there were many brine wells over in Western New York. And in about 1885, people started doing test wells for gas, and they often found salt, and this was the case in Ithaca. So some people decided to develop that salt that they found. And in 1891, the Cayuga Lake Salt Company was formed on the shore of Cayuga Lake, where Salmon Creek comes out into the lake from the hamlet of Ludlowville. And so this is in the town of Lansing, and Ludlowville is a hamlet upstream on the creek. So that place started in 1891, was an immediate success, and it lasted till 1962. Then over on Seneca Lake, the Glen Salt Company was formed in 1893. This is northwest of Watkins Glen by about a mile. So it's on Seneca Lake, and now it's called US Salt. This is still in operation, as is Watkins Salt Company, now owned by Cargill, who bought it in 1977. This is right at the south end of Seneca Lake, right in the village, and it started in 1898. Meanwhile, back in Ithaca, the little Ithaca Salt Company near what's now 3rd Street started, and it went from 1896 to 1904. On the southeast side of Cayuga Lake, north of Ithaca by about half a mile, was the big Remington Salt Company. That started in 1901. It burned down in 1916. It was immediately rebuilt, and then it ended production in 1928. And then later in 1916, but really more in 1921, the Cayuga Rock Salt Company was formed. And that's a mine dug into the ground like a coal mine. And that's near the hamlet of Myers in Lansing. It's now owned by Cargill. They bought it in 1970 and greatly modernized it. And this is still running to this day. So during my research, I found a big thesis on agricultural history in New York State. And it was completed in 1927. And the guy that wrote this gave a lot of data about shipping various goods around New York State, not only farm products, but things like salt. And so this is all too much to read, but on the bottom, I highlighted an entry from 1828 at the port of Ithaca. And so on February 11th, the boat, the Lady of the Lake, captained by Mr. Harris, brought in 119 barrels of salt. And given the date of this report, this most likely would have been from the Onondaga Salt Company up here in Syracuse. But always people were wanting salt, and so you see a lot of references to salt being taken into various ports in all the data this guy wrote down. And of course, all over New York, there's little salt springs. This is a historical marker for the salt springs at the village of Montezuma. There were many other New York locations where small amounts of salt were processed from salt springs in the early days. So, of course, there was salt in Syracuse, right here at the Onondaga Lake shore. And Syracuse, at the time the Erie Canal was built in the 1820s, was an undeveloped, swampy lowland. And a Colonel William Stone, passing through in 1820, when the population was just 250 people, he wrote this: "It was so desolate it would make an owl weep to fly over it." So since I'm a birder, I had to put that in. Anyway, the Onondaga Salt Spring Works, as you people probably all know already, is from seeps or springs on the Earth's surface or near the Earth's surface, especially at the south end of Onondaga Lake. There was quite a bit of this kind of salt seeps. And Native Americans first showed European settlers how to produce salt. And this happened in many places in New York, but especially here at Onondaga, they helped European settlers get this industry going. So they used the sun, solar evaporation, or they boiled it down in kettles to evaporate the salt brine to make refined salt. And the first kettles were on tripods that were hanging over fires. And then the very first blocks, or salt refineries, were in rows of kettles and brick supports over fires in little enclosures. And so on the left, it shows the kettles in a brick bank or block inside a building where they evaporated the salt brine over fires. And then on the right are a lot of the troughs showing salt evaporation in the sun. And this works produce salt in bushel and barrel amounts. And it was taken to market by horse and wagon, by the few rough roads that existed at the time, or on the many rivers and lakes where it was where they could do that. And so here it shows also the coverings for the troughs, those flat things in the middle of the picture, the coverings of the trough. When it rained, they put those over the troughs to keep the evaporating salt from being diluted. And it's interesting, the tolls on the Onondaga salt production helped pay for the first Erie Canal, or Clinton's Ditch. This production ended in about 1928. And later in the 1800s, two other methods of getting salt were formed. And so this is a two-part picture. You can see there the bottom. Here's the top again. On the left is a brine salt well. And so that's where a pipe, maybe 5 inches and maybe 2 pipes, are sunk down into the salt deposit, 1,800 to 2,000 feet or whatever, into the pure salt deposit. And the derrick and the building on the top house the equipment that help pump the brine back out. And on the right is the surface works of a salt mine, which is dug like a coal mine with a big shaft where people and equipment can go down into the earth. So here we have on the left, the brine well, showing the pipe going into a salt deposit. And then on the right is the salt mine, showing all the equipment in this very same salt deposit, just accessing it directly through the shaft. And in this area in Lansing, it's about 2,000 feet deep. So rock salt mines are like the Cargill one in Lansing, where a big shaft is dug, in this case, about 2,000 feet down into the earth to the salt deposit. And here they use the wall and pillar method and dynamite out the salt, and they break it up into smaller pieces and equipment that's right down in the mine, and they bring it to the surface through the shaft. This salt is used for road salt and some other industrial uses. It's not pure, less pure by far than the refined brine salt products. And once this kind of salt was used extensively for ice cream making, but when electricity became more prevalent and freezing and refrigeration were invented, they no longer needed salt for this purpose. So here's a nice drawing I found in the Lansing History Archives of the rock salt mine on Cayuga Lake. So this is on Cayuga Lake in Lansing, and it's right next to the body of water. Again, dug into the earth like a coal mine. And note the red arrow shows a canal boat by the dock out in the lake. So this was one of my first clues about using canal boats to go up the lake to ship salt. So here we are down in the mine, a big pillar of salt right there in front of us and several other ones visible here and there. And you can see they've got really huge equipment down there. They drive trucks down there. They have all the equipment to break up pieces of salt there. And it's miles long. It's all under Cayuga Lake, because that way they don't have to buy mineral rights under each person's property on the shore. So it's all under the lake, about 2,000 feet down. Then back to the brine company, the Cayuga Lake Salt Company, as it was called in its first years, started in 1891, and this picture is from about 1892, and the very first buildings they had at this place. And again, this was evaporating brine to make refined table salt. Later, in about 1904, it was called International Salt Company. And Cayuga Lake's in the background there. So brine salt plants like this one drill narrow wells about 2,000 feet into the same salt deposit that's over there at the rock salt mine. And water's pumped down into the deposit to make brine, and then the concentrated brine is pumped back out and evaporated using big vacuum pans to produce fine grade salts for food use. And here's a nice photograph we have of the company when it got a lot bigger in 1904. The buildings are all wooden at this point. And on the lower left is shown one vacuum pan. They look more like a rocket ship than a pan, but that's what they called them, vacuum pans. And they were housed in the tallest building you see in the picture. Then right next to the red arrow that's pointing to a big dock out in Cayuga Lake is a shorter, pointy building, and that's the first brine well at this place. But it had quite a few brine wells, as you'll see in a minute. So a lot of those wooden buildings burned down in about 1907 and 1908. So the place was immediately rebuilt with bricks after this fire. And the vacuum pans, again, shown in the upper right, is the little vacuum pan. About 4 vacuum pans were housed in the great tall building in the middle that was now made of brick. And again, the pointy building with the green arrow is the first brine well. Off to the right in this picture, next to the vacuum pan insert, is another derrick over another brine well. So there were quite a few around. So this was a very efficient production of salt. So this is just one of the many gigantic piles of salt, tons of salt that they were able to make in a short time with this method of refined brine. And this company employed quite a few women. And here you see woman in probably 1895-ish costume, and she's sewing the tops of the bags of salt up so they can be taken to market. And I think these bags of salt held about 200 pounds. So anyway, women always worked at this plant, and they did what we'd call women's work, like sewing and things like that. So it provided good jobs for both genders, and also teenage kids sometimes too. So note where the red arrow is in this picture. This is showing the plant from out in Cayuga Lake, right where Salmon Creek enters the lake. And the red arrow is showing a gigantic pile of coal. And Dave Plumeau, who's the unofficial historian at the rock salt mine, told me that it took a ton of coal to produce the heat to make 2 tons of refined salt. It also took a lot of water to make the brine from the salt deposits below the earth. And so plants like this are ideally situated on these big lakes because they got plenty of water. And at this time, they were near the Pennsylvania coal fields to the south. So this is what that place looks like now. It's there's no buildings there at all. It was all taken down in 1964. And this is now called Salt Point. There's a lot of salt points around New York, but this is our salt point on Cayuga Lake in the town of Lansing. And it's now a nice natural area with some nice paths and trails. And Osprey Tower off in the distance in the right-hand picture. That Osprey Tower has been occupied by pairs of ospreys ever since it was put up about 10 years ago. So we found this map of where all the old brine wells were, and they're all capped now, except for one of them. So the pink dots on this outline of present-day Salt Point show where all the different brine wells were, and you can't see any of those now. They've all been capped off and covered up. But we did find one where the blue arrow is pointing at the blue dot out a little bit away from Salt Point. And it just happened, we had a nice photograph from 1909 that showed the derrick that was over this brine well casing back in the day. And so there's Salmon Creek running along in front of the derrick, and the red arrow shows the derrick over that well, and the big salt plant off to the left, right by Cayuga Lake. So you can go see this today. It's right near the Myers Road Bridge and opposite Salt Point Road that goes into the natural area. Down by Ithaca, the Remington Salt Company was also a huge company with a lot of different buildings. And I like this picture because it shows a canal barge. So it was adding to my limited knowledge of shipping salt by canal barge up to the Erie Canal. But anyway, this was quite a huge plant and was successful for a while. They did a lot of advertising. I found these 2 different ads. One of them was an invitation to come and tour their plant and see how salt was made. And on the right is one advertising their crystalline brand of table salt. So showing the same picture of the plant and the canal boat in by their dock. Then a small company down in Ithaca proper was the Ithaca Salt Company, and we think it was in the area that's now 3rd Street in Ithaca. Ithaca, like many of the big Finger Lakes, had a big marsh at both ends before people drained them all and built things on them. This now is full of houses and businesses and roads and the Ithaca High School. But for a while, the Ithaca Salt Company operated there. Cornell University's on the hill up to the left. So getting into canal stuff, first of all, of course, there was Clinton's Ditch, or the original Erie Canal, and it was completed from the east, I think from around Schenectady, to the village of Montezuma, New York by 1819. And then, of course, it was taken on to Buffalo by 1825. And this isn't the Montezuma Wildlife Refuge. That place at the time was, of course, a huge swamp. And that was one of the most difficult places that I learned about for completing the canal through that area, because it was hard to keep the canal together in all that swampy land. But in Montezuma Village, a boat called the Montezuma was built there, and it was said to be the first boat on the canal. And it took passengers to Syracuse from Montezuma in 1820. So, of course, the original Erie Canal was an immediate success, as all of you know. It took farm products, salt, most likely from here in Onondaga, plaster, lumber, and other products. They were shipped from the interior of New York, west to the Great Lakes, and east down the Hudson River to New York City. And of course, a lot of people went up to upstate villages. They started cities, as well as moving out to the Midwest US. And Erie Canal contributed to New York City becoming one of the premier ports of the United States instead of Philadelphia or New Orleans. And again, the tolls on the Onondaga Salt Springs salt helped repay the canal building debt in less than 9 years. Many people don't realize the US government had nothing to do with paying for any of the iterations of the Erie Canal. New York paid for it all. So it was good that the tax on salt helped to repay the debt. And Scott McLaughlin did this nice drawing comparing the original Erie Canal or Clinton's Ditch with the enlarged Erie Canal that was being built over the years between 1835 and 1862. So, of course, the prism or the channel of the canal went from being fairly little to deeper and wider. And also, the boats that could go on the canal became bigger and wider and longer, and they could carry more cargo. And of course, the locomotion on the canals, the first two canals, was the towpath with the mules or horses pulling the boats on ropes. And of course, there's a man by each team to keep the horses or mules on the path and keep them going. And one thing I found right here in the museum was this thing that kids usually like to see, and it's tailing off. And the mules and horses were often stabled in the forward cabin of boats. And to get on and off, they had to go over this narrow gangplank. And so the people held them by their tail to steady them as they crossed over. And then I put together a bunch of data for people that don't know all this stuff about the canal building that compared the enlarged Erie Canal with the barge canal that was completed in 1918. And so, of course, the route of the first two canals was an artificially dug through the ground channel along about 95% of its route. But the barge canal used canalized streams, rivers, and lakes for about 70% of the route of the canal, because by then they had the technology to be able to do what's called canalizing. And the traction force, of course, at first was animal power on the towpath, and now all the vessels are motorized, so there's no towpath anywhere. Lock gates were wooden versus steel, operation by hand versus electric power in a nice building. The composition of the building materials was all cut and dressed stone for the first two canals, and then concrete and steel for the barge canal. There were 32 aqueducts on the enlarged Erie Canal, and now there's only one at Medina, New York, on the barge canal system. And of course, locked lift and the lock dimensions got a lot bigger, and the channel dimensions got much bigger too with the barge canal. So the barge was nicknamed the 1,000-ton canal because it could hold much larger boats and a lot more cargo and move them through the canal a lot faster than in the old days. But very early on, they started making lateral canals, and one of the important ones was the Cayuga and Seneca Canal, and this joined Seneca Lake and Cayuga Lake to the Erie Canal at Montezuma, New York. Again, this is the town of Montezuma. And this was completed by 1828. This is a historical marker that's right in the really nice Montezuma Heritage Park in Montezuma. And if you haven't been there, it's definitely worth a trip to see not only a lot of the enlarged Erie Canal bed still there, but also even a little part of Clinton's Ditch. And so this part of the canal that went to Montezuma was a side cut that was dug from the northeast side of Cayuga Lake at the village of Cayuga in the north end of Cayuga Lake. So the Seneca part of the canal came down from Seneca Falls, kind of along with the Seneca River and improving that as much as they could at the time. And then they'd go through the north end of Cayuga Lake over to the side cut that went up to Montezuma. And so this side cut existed until the barge canal in 1918. And this shows the end of the CNS canal in one of these really lovely 1900 postcards. And it's quite a bit the same. I was just there on a boat trip with people from Kendall in Ithaca. And I think the bridge is different, but basically the entrance to the CNS canal from Seneca Lake at Geneva is about the same. And at the Montezuma Heritage Park, you can go see this wonderful old lock that's right near where the Cayuga and Seneca Canal came into the enlarged Erie Canal. This is lock number 11. It's the last lock. In the left-hand photo, you can see what's left of the towpath with trees and bushes growing on it. And also in both photos, you can see the nice gate stonework where the lock gates would have folded back into the stone to let the boats in. So you can see it has a little bit of water still in it. So I always go visit this when I go to Montezuma Heritage Park because it's so pretty. This is the other end of that side cut off of Cayuga Lake of the CNS Canal. And this shows a cement boat from the Cayuga Lake Cement Company, which was just south of the rock salt mine in Lansing. And so this boat is going in the first lock in the Cayuga part of the CNS Canal. And you can see in the background, there's a steamboat on the lake. And that's how boats like this got pulled up Seneca and Cayuga lakes by steamboats because there were no towpaths along those big lakes. So they didn't have a towpath until they got up to the dug canals. So when they started talking about improving the canal system and proposing the new dimensions of the barge canal in 1909, many people in the state thought they ought to just leave all these lateral canals the same size as they already were and not spend any money to improve them to the barge canal standards. But people like Jared Newman, the mayor of Ithaca, from whom all this is paraphrased, in the Finger Lakes region, they really wanted the CNS canal to be made larger like the barge canal. And so this is what Jared Newman, the mayor of Ithaca, said about this in his argument to improve the canal. The south ends of Cayuga and Seneca Lakes are near the Pennsylvania coal fields, which at that time in our history were very important. Everybody used coal for lots of things. Cement and gypsum were produced on Cayuga Lake, but most important, he said, is the production of salt, which could be shipped by water. Already the salt production on Cayuga and Seneca Lakes rivals all of that in the Western New York plants, and it has surpassed the salt production at Onondaga. And they now knew that their layer of solid salt that they were tapping into in both the rock salt mine and the brine plants was 248 feet thick. And this was a quantity of salt to supply the world, and it was close to the ocean and the port of New York. So that's from the mayor of Ithaca. And his and other arguments in favor of upgrading the CNS Canal prevailed. And so now this is a modern map showing the CNS Canal in its enlarged, improved condition, all the way from Geneva with 4 different locks up to where the canal enters the Seneca River. So that's the modern route. So that side cut, you can still find where a fair amount of that is, both in Montezuma and along the way after the thruway up to Route 20. But after that, it's been filled in. So anyway, this compares the nice old block from 1828 at Montezuma with the modern CNS Canal in about 2007. These aren't to scale with each other, but it shows obviously the CNS canal is now up to barge canal standards. So some early boats. One type of early boat were called bateaux, French for boats. And the boats in this picture are replicas of bateaux from 1756. And they don't really look like it in the picture, but they're 25 feet long and they're propelled by either oars or poles. And they could carry 6 to 8 tons of cargo if they were properly loaded. At the time, there were also Durham boats that were a lot larger and heavier. Of course, all the time during this early era, there were sailboats. And in the early 1800s, steamboats were invented on the big lakes and on the Hudson River. And the steamboats carried passengers, they acted as ferry boats. And then when they were surpassed by better steamboats, the old steamboats were used as tug or towboats to pull canal boats up and down Cayuga and Seneca Lake. And the first of many of these steamboats in Cayuga Lake was the Enterprise. It was built in 1820, and it took passengers, and then it was a towboat for canal barges between 1827 and 1831. And some writing we do have from early Lansing residents about boats. Alice Bristol, who wrote a nice little history of Ludlowville from the 1930s, wrote, "Lakeside residents saw strings of canal boats on the lake, sometimes 6, 8 or more, tied one behind the other and towed by a discarded passenger steamboat." And I think she was referring to the later 1800s when this was going on. She also wrote that the very first freight and canal boat on Cayuga Lake was built by Samuel Baker, an early Lansing settler, before the steamboat era, I think. So Ithaca itself became a thriving boat building center, even though it was 40 miles south of the Erie Canal. There was a lot of need for boat building in that time, and our History Center in Tompkins County has a lot of documented information about the many different boat builders in Ithaca. So this picture shows the new boat called the J.L. Mott Jr., ready to be launched from one of the many Ithaca boat yards in the mid-1800s. And barges were used all over the place on Cayuga Lake. We don't have too many pictures of that, but here's one I found of the L.H. Owen grain mill at Frontenac Point. This is on the west side of Cayuga Lake. It was a very important business in the 1800s. And the ferry boat from the east side of the lake at Lansing Station went back and forth to this dock as well. And so they carried people and products back and forth across the lake. And at this place's dock, you can see 4 bullhead canal boats and then a big sailboat there. And then over on the east side, what used to be Drake Point in the 1800s was later called Portland Point because of the cement plant that was nearby. And this was a place where they docked a lot of canal boats, these bullhead canal boats. And this was just south of the big rock salt mine. Then down at Ithaca, this photo from 1900 shows a lot of lake steamers at Renwick Pier in Ithaca, and all the passengers going to go on excursions or journeys up the lake to the other end. Then down in the inlet in Ithaca, just different kinds of boats in the 1800s. There's a sailboat in the back, a big steamboat, and it was the only one in the Ithaca area, Cayuga Lake area, that had 2 smokestacks rather than 1, and in the front, a typical bullhead barge. And Lansing itself also had a few people that built boats, and one of them was Captain Dick Howell. He's from a long line of the Howell family that goes back to the 1700s. The Howells are still living in Lansing, and he and his partner Sperry built the Clayton, which is shown in this fuzzy picture on the right. And Dick used the Clayton for all sorts of things, for passengers, for freight, small bunches of freight, and then later he used it as a towboat as well. It sank in 1890. a lot of these boats were very prone to catching on fire and sinking or being overtaken by storms and being destroyed. So here we see another steamboat at the actual pier at the International Salt Company, which previously was the Cayuga Lake Salt Company, the brine plant. So here's the Hiawatha. It was built by a famous boat builder, George Burling, and his helper. George Burling worked both in Ithaca boat yards and in Lansing. And so here's the Hiawatha, and this is in 1908. And it may be there to bring in materials or to take away a canal boat with salt in it. This burned in 1912. Then this is looking back at the plant from the end of that same dock, looking back at the plant from out in the lake. And you can see there's at least one boat in the slip there. This photo is labeled 1908. And so local writings that I found in the Lansing History Archives noted that this brine salt plant at Ludlowville increased the Erie Canal traffic after it was built in 1891. That is, the salt plant was built in 1891. And an employee and Lansing resident, Oliver Holden, could well remember the happy braying of the mules as they were unloaded from the boats and turned out to the grass on the point while the boats were being loaded. He also recalled the loading of a boat with 200-pound bags of salt, hot and fresh from the dryers, at a temperature of 90 degrees, and the exhausting labor of stacking the bags in the boat. And I found this nice photograph. It's labeled on the bottom, Loading Boats, 1900. And what's curious about this is at the Cayuga Lake Salt Company. It's curious because here they are loading a canal boat with salt through a railroad car, because the doors of the warehouse were built rather high off the ground. And so the railroad car was at a better height to take a conveyor through it to the canal boat. So here's a competitor for shipping salt, a railroad car, being used to help load canal boats. Its competitor. So I thought that was pretty neat. This is one of the few photos we have of loading salt into a canal boat at this plant. Then meanwhile, half mile to the south, Oliver Holden's son, Cliff Holden, gave this photo in 1962 to the Lansing History Association. And it shows the rock salt mine, a photo of the rock salt mine at the time, with all its big dock and conveyor systems down on Cayuga Lake. And we came across some photographs in Lansing's files of the Cayuga rock salt mine in about 1926. This shows some canal boats docked by the black thing in the middle is the dock complex of the rock salt mine, and there's people on top of it. It's a little hard to tell. But also you notice the boats have dirty bottoms. They're sitting high in the water. So this is before they were loaded with salt, and the dirty bottoms were exposed because the boats weren't very heavy. Here's another shot of canal boats, probably after they were loaded. There's 6 canal boats there, and at the very top center of this photo shows a tugboat. So this is 1926 when they would have been going up to the barge canal and towed by self-motorized boats. And the bottom barge has an open hold on the left, and it looks to me like there's piles of white salt in that opening. This picture shows them loading one of the boats, and the tugboat is standing by, lots of steam. And then this picture, done at the same time, shows the tugboat, and in the picture, he's towing 2 canal barges with salt in them away. But I've looked at this photo with a magnifying glass, and off to the left are 2 lines that go out of the picture, which are probably hooked up to 2 more boats. And behind that, there were probably 2 more. So this tug was probably actually taking 6 boats up Cayuga Lake to the Erie Canal. So there was some actual documentation at the rock salt mine of shipping salt this way. And Craig Williams introduced me to this data source. I only copied out one set of data here for salt shipment from Finger Lakes ports from 1922 to 1926. And I highlighted in yellow the companies that I was concerned with on Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. So Ludlowville is the table salt company. You can see from 1922 to 26, they had several thousand tons of salt shipped. Myers is the Cayuga rock salt mine. So they didn't really get going until about 1921 or 22. But by 25 and 26, you can see there's quite a lot of salt shipped from there. Then Remington Salt down by Ithaca had data in this stuff for a couple years. And then Watkins Salt had quite a bit of salt shipped from there too. And so the thing at the bottom says salt originating at Cayuga Seneca Canal ports totaled over 33,000 tons for these seasons. Then I found this nice picture of the Watkins Salt Company, which is now owned by Cargill, at the very bottom of Seneca Lake. And the title of this slide is also what's on the banners that's on each side of each of these 5 canal boats at this salt company. So loaded by Watkins Salt Company, Watkins, New York, with table salt for New York City. And here in this picture, the tugboat's off in the center left of the picture. You can see the smoke, and it's going to tow these boats up Seneca Lake through the C&S Canal and into the Erie Canal and down to New York. I also found while I was looking for information, there's a survey team using modern imaging equipment on Seneca Lake, and they're studying canal boat shipwrecks at the bottom of Seneca Lake. And there's quite a few they found. This is the cover on the right of their excellent 2019 report. And if you haven't seen this, I'd recommend getting it because it's very interesting. And I think they're about to come out with a new report on further research that they've done. So that was pretty interesting to find this. Then finally, this picture on the left, I had a really lousy reproduction of this picture, and I was always trying to find the original for it, and I couldn't seem to find it for a fair while. The photograph came from Levi Wood Jr., who was an employee at International Salt in the 50s and 60s, and he was their magazine editor. They had a small magazine, and I don't know if he took this photograph or somebody else did, but the photograph is from 1936, and it shows the Susie Scully barge at International Salt Company's dock in 1936. So I blew up the photo a little bit, and that's what's in the bottom right. The left-hand arrow pointing down is that showing the ubiquitous railroad car. Always there were railroad cars there, so they were definitely using them probably to ship salt. But the right-hand arrow pointing to the right shows a guy posing above a conveyor system with big bags of salt. And by then, this left-hand photo shows the bottom big arrow. They had made a conveyor system built on train wheels so they could move that along by the all these doors at the salt warehouse, and they didn't have to use a railroad car anymore. And then the curved arrow on the top shows the guy posing with a bag of salt, ready to dump it onto the conveyor. And then the right-hand photo, which is a separate photo I found, shows the train wheels even better with the conveyor belt going from the warehouse out into the canal boat. So they could move that contraption up and down by all these different doors of the warehouse. And I even found a little photo that showed this from the inside of the warehouse with a guy posing with the bags of salt, putting it on the conveyor that somehow automatically took it out to the boat. And there's Cayuga Lake in the background. So by the time I got going on all this research, there were almost no people left alive that knew anything directly about international salt. But I was able to interview Gus Isaacs, who was born in 1923, and he's now 102 years old. And although he's very deaf, I had to write all my questions to him. and his granddaughter helped me with his answers, but he's very lucid and he doesn't have any real bad memory problems. So it was really a delight to talk to him about this salt company. So he worked at International Salt both before and after World War II, from 1937 to 1942, and then after the war when he came back from 1945 to 1962. And 62 was when they closed the Cayuga Lake Salt Company. One job he had probably in the 30s when he was a very young man was sewing shut the bags of salt. And he remembered that boats, trains, and trucks were all used for salt shipping over the years. And he does remember a few canal barges being used before and after World War II, although he didn't have any real figures on that. He said salt was taken to New York City by tugs towing the barges up to the barge canal. He said by then, probably there were 100-pound bags of salt, plus they often filled bulk salt right into the holds of the boats. He was not clear about how often canal boats were used, perhaps once a month after World War II. And he said in the bulk barges, there were tons of salt in the barge, so that was the size of the load. Of course, railroads existed all in central New York before 1870. This shows a big engine down in Ithaca. And the Cayuga Lake Salt Company, formed in 1891, here it is in its early stages in 1892. This railroad was already there in 1870, so they built that salt plant not only by Cayuga Lake, but also by the railroad. So clearly they were using railroads for shipping. And this is about a 1920 map of all the different railroad lines that were around the Finger Lakes during that time. Lehigh Valley Company consolidated a lot of different companies into one big company. And so it shows in pink all the different railroad lines. And talking about railroads could be a whole other talk, of course, which we don't have time for here. But by the time the 1970s rolled around, there was only one railroad by Cayuga Lake. All the others were gone pretty much by then. And they were Lehigh Valley Company at that time. So this picture shows a train pulling empty hopper cars up the track to the rock salt mine in 1973. And in the background is the Penn-Dixie cement plant. I think that's just the remains of it. It had closed by then. And Cayuga Lake's right there on the right. And so this same railroad, now owned by Norfolk Southern, still goes up the east side of Cayuga Lake to the defunct power plant up at Milliken Station. And they still ship salt, some of the salt out of the rock salt mine using railroad cars. So I found one good picture of the truck bays at the International Salt Company, the Brine Salt Company, and note the adjacent railroad car. But here's truck bays, and then the only truck picture I found so far was the Sterling Salt truck from the 1950s, and Sterling Salt was the name of their table salt product at that time. Then last February, I went to Watkins Glen to visit US Salt and find out what I could there. And here's a semi-trailer truck on its way to US Salt in 2024. And here I am in my car going into the US Salt plant. This is on the west side of Seneca Lake, just north of Watkins Glen. And right over the guardrail here from that truck is a railroad track. So they're still probably using railroad cars as well as big trucks to take salt to the market. In the 50s, somebody made this really nice flow chart of the vacuum pan evaporating system and all the other apparatus from the brine well to the finished products at International Salt. Again, this is the brine plant for table salt. And down on the right of that picture, I blew it up and shows a bunch of salt products being put on either a truck or a railroad car but it doesn't show any canal barges. So this company, at least by 1956, the brine salt plant, wasn't using canal boats anymore. But just a half mile away to the south, here's this 1952 labeled picture of the Cayuga rock salt mine complex. And right down in the bottom center is the barge loading dock. Up to the left of that, on the left side, is Lehigh Valley Railroad main line. So they were using the railroad. And then up in the middle of the picture is the truck weigh scale. And indeed, while I was driving here today, when I was in the Lansing area, I went by several salt trucks that are on their way to start bringing salt, road salt, to all different parts of New York State. And then my neighbor on Lansing Station Road, my former neighbor, who's my contemporary, about 75 years old, remembers Cayuga rock salt being shipped by boat up to the barge canal in the early 1960s. And he said it was just now and then, but he remembers the tugboats used diesel fuel. They had the same pilings and docks there and an overhead conveyor belt. And he remembers the barges. And then Dave Plumeau, the unofficial historian of the rock salt mine, said the destination for this salt could have been anywhere east of here, about 15,000 tons in one shipment. And Dave said mass water shipping is insanely cheap compared to truck or rail. And then while I was up at the Canal Museum at Port Byron in 2023, when I started this work, I happened to pick up a bunch of bottoming out magazines that they offered me. So I had several different issues. I didn't look at them at the time, but when I got them back home and started reading through them, I found this one that reported a test run for a new commercial adventure was going to take place on the barge canal. So this Marine Corporation sent a tugboat and a barge to the Cargill facility on Cayuga Lake, where it was going to be loaded with 2,000 tons of rock salt. And the boats were going to Albany via the Cayuga and Seneca and Erie divisions of the barge canal. And this road salt was for winter use on the New York State Thruway, and that was from bottoming out number 38. When I interviewed workers at the rock salt mine, after I found this, they vaguely remember this happening. It happened once. They thought it was really 1995, not 96, but they couldn't tell why it was never repeated. But apparently they just did it this one time. So as late as the 1990s, at least one barge took salt away from the rock salt mine. So far, this is what I've found out about shipping salt from Cayuga Lake to the Erie Canal. And this dock and canal slip you see in this picture lasted until 1962, when the plant closed. Its sister plant on Seneca Lake, called Glen Salt Company, or now U.S. Salt, is still operating. And this 1978 photo shows the canal slip, or what's left of it, after the 1964 demolition of the plant. So by this time, either the lake and erosion forces filled in most of the canal slip, or maybe when they ripped down all the buildings of the brine salt plant in 1964, and they spread them out all over the ground at what is now Salt Point, maybe then they filled in much of the canal slip. We just don't know. They covered everything up with soil. And in this picture, you can see the old dock pilings on the far side of what's left of the canal slip. And at the bottom of that ground there on the far side of the little cove are all big cement pieces of materials from the buildings at the salt plant. This recent photo from last February shows the left-hand picture, shows the present winter view of the old dock pilings out in the lake. They're still there. And the right-hand aerial photo I drew in with yellow lines where those pilings are going out into Cayuga Lake, and the tiny little bit that's left of the canal slip. In the winter, the water level of Cayuga Lake is lowered 3 feet and the pilings are exposed. So these two photos show that when they closed the plant in 1962, shortly thereafter, they took down part of the tallest building and they removed the big vacuum pans. There were 4 of them. Then when I visited US Salt, they have a history display in their lobby. And lo and behold, here's those same vacuum pans wrapped up in padding being unloaded from the trucks over at the sister company, the Glen Salt Company, on the west side of Seneca Lake. And then in the right-hand photo, one of them is being installed before the wrappings came off. And I found out that day that they're still operating over there today. So that was pretty cool. So we're at an end here, and I just wanted to show many of my sources of information, and I know you can't read this, but I can show it to you later if you want to read it up close. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much.
We've already been getting a few questions on Zoom, and a lot of people learned some new things today, so that was great. I know I did as well. One person was curious, just I guess asking for clarification, is Cargill the only company mining salt at the moment, or does US Salt?
No, Cargill is mining salt in the town of Lansing underneath Cayuga Lake. The Cargill facility at the south end of Seneca Lake is a brine salt plant. So on Seneca Lake, there's still 2 operating brine salt plants.
Okay,
and apparently they have enough business that they stay in business. A lot of the other brine plants, almost all of them in the country, have gone out of business. So these 2 companies over there are the ones still operating and making table salt. One thing that was funny, the display in the lobby of US Salt, they had these pink salt containers, and they were called Himalayan salt, Himalayan pink salt. So they're taking pure white salt they get from under the ground here and adding a few of the proper impurities to make it pink, like Himalayan salt.
Nice.
Whatever that is.
Wow. Advertising. Cool. Huh. The digging for salt underneath the lake sounds terrifying.
Yeah, it's quite far below. Cayuga Lake is presently 430 feet deep. Its trough is probably much deeper than that, but in the 12,000 years since the glaciers melted, it's filled up with a lot of sediment down there. But the mine is pretty far below that, and there's a big bunch of bedrock in between the top of the mine and the lake. Although some geologists are concerned they're getting to a point where that bedrock might be very thin and weaker.
Okay.
So there's a lot of controversy right now about that rock salt mine.
You want to apply for jobs at Cargill?
It does provide, I think it provides at least 200 jobs for people in Lansing.
Cool.
So,
another question. So you mentioned a lot of these salt companies being built near lakes for access
yeah,
to
a few
water.
of them. Yeah, a few of them.
Yeah. The questions about kind of the pollution levels in like Cayuga Lake, because they've heard that Onondaga Lake, its pollution kind of contributed to the death of the Syracuse salt industry because it degraded the.
Yeah, I don't think
salt.
Pollution in Onondaga Lake contributed to the death of the Onondaga Salt Company. It was an inefficient way to do it. I mean, that big pile of salt I showed right after I got done talking about Onondaga salt, they were bushel and barrel amounts. And then these brine plants where they could tap that giant deposit under the earth, they made tons. I mean, I've got all these pictures of big piles of salt like that, pure refined dried salt that they're bagging up. And Cayuga Lake is much cleaner than Onondaga Lake because it never had any other bad industries around it. So in the modern day, it's polluted by farm runoff mainly, and a little bit, they think, from some parts of the rock salt mine operation, because in the past, before they knew better, they dumped some salt they didn't want into the lake. But generally, even the salinity level isn't too horrible. But but Onondaga went out of business because it wasn't an efficient way to do it. Just like Ithaca and Remington and all the Western New York plants went out of business because they couldn't really compete with these three on Cayuga Lake and Seneca Lake.
Yeah.
Economically.
Yeah. Speaking of Remington, though, I was curious, is Remington related at all to the other big Remington companies along the canal, the firearms and typewriter manufacturers?
I didn't run across anything that said that, so
Okay.
I'm not sure.
All right.
And I can't even remember where the name came from. I had that first slide I had with my heaps of books and papers, and there's a little bit in there about Remington, but not too much. And our history center in Tompkins County doesn't even have too much about them.
Got it.
So,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure. I bet it isn't the same Remington.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. They strangely diversified into
Yeah.
guns and typewriters.
Yeah.
So maybe they had
Well, we
small
had
guns there,
Ithaca
too.
gun too.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a huge, there's still all kinds of controversy about all the lead seeping down the hill from that place. Luckily, it's pretty far from the lake, but it's right by a major river.
Yes. One person asked on Zoom, have you heard at all of the miners, if they have to go that far down, do they get the bends or anything like that
No.
due to pressure differences?
No, it's not, they're not underwater,
Okay.
so there isn't any water pressure on them. They're down in the mine in the salt. And apparently being surrounded by an atmosphere of salt is not harmful.
Huh.
I mean, after all, our own bodies have quite a lot of NaCl in them. And so,
Okay.
so apparently there's never been any ill effects of working down there from that source, from being surrounded by salt dust. And so.
Nice. All right. We have one more question on here. Maybe two. It was about how did the early salt industry get its fuel? You know,
Coal.
it was coal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I don't know what they're using. I was not able to interview anybody for very long when I went to US Salt. I went there unannounced because I happened to be on that side of Seneca Lake anyway for another purpose. And so the guy and the engineer I talked to, we covered some things, but I didn't actually get to ask him about the fuel they now use. I'm pretty sure it's natural gas, though.
oh, yeah.
There's a lot of natural gas wells down in that area of the world.
Anyone here have a question?
You had that data up. There's a ton of salt out of Rochester. What was that?
I think that might have been from the big salt plant in Detroit
Oh, really?
at the time.
Okay.
I didn't have time to look into that huge number.
Yeah. that's big.
And I had to try to keep this talk under an hour. So I really didn't spend any time looking into that, but I am aware that there was a great big brine salt plant near Detroit. And so it may have been from there that it was coming through Lake Erie into Ontario and then into Rochester to go down to New York City from there. And that's just a guess, though.
One other person asked, is the salt deposit at Onondaga the same as the one under the Finger Lakes?
Yeah, basically, it's from one level that came from that big inland sea 400 million years ago that kept evaporating and getting rehydrated and evaporating and making all these different layers. And the one here just happened to be very close to the surface. And it's kind of funny in Lansing. I lived in Lansing for about 36 years before I went to my present residence. And there's often salt in people's water wells out there. And I think there's a few salt seeps right on the road I lived on, because the pH of the soil is like 9 or something. When you do a garden pH, I mean, soil shouldn't be pH 9, and nothing can grow in it because I think it's salt. And, so I think there's little levels of salt up to the surface here and there.
Okay.
There certainly were in the Cayuga rock salt mine. At first, it didn't succeed because they only got down to kind of impure bunches of levels of salt. And then finally, in 1921, they got down deep enough, they hit that same pure big layer that the brine salt company was tapped into.
And there's one more, but sorry, I said there's one more question 2 times already. What did the invention of refrigeration do to the salt industry? Due to how prevalent salt was?
Well, freezing and refrigeration made it so they didn't have to use salt to help cool things like ice cream and other products that needed to be frozen. And so, first electricity came in, and then they developed various appliances and for industry and the home, refrigerators and freezers. So that was a lot more efficient to freeze ice cream than doing big crank machines with salt on the outside to keep it cold. So, so up until the 1930s, rock salt was used to make ice cream a lot. And then that market went away. But there's other industrial uses that I didn't really look into too much, but where they can use impure salt.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we get it all over our roads in the winter.
Sure.
So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been fun.